Admiral Marcus Bradley, the first black admiral at a high-stakes NATO summit, isn't just facing global military challenges, he's fighting to prove he belongs. As rivals question his authority and prejudice lingers beneath the surface, Marcus must navigate intense opposition while shaping the future of international defense. Will his vision for change overcome the doubts stacked against him? What happens next? Share your thoughts and subscribe for more compelling stories of leadership, resilience, and defying the odds. Marcus Bradley adjusted the straps on his simple black duffel bag, standing in the long security line at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The day was gray and uneventful outside, but inside the bustling terminal, Marcus's mind was focused on the international summit he was scheduled to attend. World leaders and top military brass would be gathering in Washington, D.C. to discuss global defense strategies, and Marcus knew his presence would be essential in shaping the next steps. This was his duty, and the stakes were high. He had long ago become accustomed to the pace of travel, endless airport terminals, long flights, and tight security. But today, something was different. Maybe it was the way the passengers around him kept glancing at him, curiosity and suspicion evident in their eyes. Marcus, dressed in a simple gray hoodie and worn blue jeans, was nearly unrecognizable from his usual public persona. Gone were the crisp military uniforms and rows of medals. Today he was just a man among many, or so he hoped. The queue inched forward. Marcus kept his eyes on the digital clock above the check-in counter, mentally calculating the time he had left before his flight. Tight, but manageable. "Hey," a voice called out behind him. "You in a rush?" Marcus turned to see a man in his mid-40s, sharply dressed in a navy blue business suit. The man smiled, but his eyes carried something else, with a hint of judgment or annoyance, perhaps. Marcus forced a smile and nodded politely. "No rush, just trying to get through like everyone else." The man said nothing further, but his gaze lingered a few seconds longer than necessary before turning back to his phone. Marcus exhaled, adjusting the duffel bag once again. He could feel the stares, the way people assessed him. Some of them probably recognized him. He had been on TV before, featured in interviews, but today he blended into the crowd, almost too well. He cleared security quickly enough with a nod from the officer who checked his military ID. It wasn't the first time he had seen the slight pause when they looked at the photo, then at him, and back again. A black man with a quiet demeanor and an unassuming appearance didn't always fit their expectations of a decorated Navy admiral, but he had long learned to ignore the subtle judgments. The work he did, the difference he made, that's what mattered, not the stares. As Marcus walked through the terminal toward his gate, his thoughts drifted to the upcoming summit. There had been whispers of tension between allied nations, disagreements over defense strategies, budgets, and the balance of power. His role at the summit was critical. He wasn't just another voice in the room. He was one of the few people who could broker understanding between military leaders with conflicting interests. For Marcus, this wasn't just about international politics or strategy. It was about preventing conflict, keeping peace, and ensuring the safety of countless lives. As an admiral, he had been on the front lines of decision-making for years, and he had seen firsthand the cost of mistakes made in those rooms. That's why he knew he couldn't afford to be late, not this time. Yet despite the gravity of the mission, a nagging feeling gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the summit. It was the undercurrent of tension he had felt throughout his career, moments where his authority had been questioned, not because of his skill or competence, but because of how he looked. Even now, decades into his career, that familiar sting hadn't entirely faded. Marcus reached the gate for his flight, taking a seat near the window to wait. He glanced at the digital clock again, his mind already racing ahead to the meeting. He thought about the briefings, the points he wanted to raise, and the conversations that needed to happen. But above all, he thought about how important it was to be in that room, to have his voice heard at the right time. Flight 622 to Washington, D.C., boarding in 10 minutes, a voice announced over the PA system. Marcus stood, heading for the line. His priority status as a first-class passenger should make the process smooth, but as he approached the gate agent, a familiar feeling began to settle over him, the sense that something wasn't quite right. He handed his ticket and ID to the gate agent, a young woman with blonde hair tied in a tight bun. She glanced at his ID, then back up at him, her brow furrowed slightly, the look of indifference on her face quickly shifting into something more uncertain. Marcus could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, her struggle to reconcile the man standing in front of her with the rank and name on the ID. Her eyes flicked up and down, taking in his casual attire. A hoodie and jeans didn't exactly scream high-ranking officer, but Marcus didn't have time to think about that now. He had to get on this flight. He could feel the seconds ticking away. "Is this your flight, sir?" the gate agent asked, her voice polite but laced with doubt. Marcus nodded, his face calm. "Yes, I'm flying first class to Washington, D.C." He spoke clearly, knowing what was about to happen. She glanced back at the ID again, her eyes lingering on the Navy emblem. Her hesitation was palpable. Marcus, though used to this kind of scrutiny, felt his patience waver. He knew what was coming next. It wasn't the first time his appearance had made others question his credentials, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. "I'm sorry, sir. I just need to verify this," the gate agent said, motioning for her colleague, a young man named David. David approached, wearing a look of professional skepticism. He took the ID from the agent, inspecting it as if searching for something that didn't quite fit. Marcus felt the weight of the judgment, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Did he really belong in first class? Was he truly an admiral? David's fingers traced the edges of the ID, flipping it over as if a closer look might reveal something out of place. Marcus stood still, keeping his posture relaxed, though the minutes ticking by were pushing him closer to frustration. "This seems unusual," David muttered to himself, still staring at the ID. "Are you sure this is your flight, sir?" Marcus clenched his jaw slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Yes. I'm Admiral Marcus Bradley, U.S. Navy. I'm on my way to a critical meeting in Washington. I'd appreciate it if we could speed this up." David barely glanced up, continuing his ID examination. "I just need to double-check," he said, then walked off with the ID toward a back office. The gate agent avoided Marcus's gaze, standing awkwardly behind the counter. Passengers waiting in line were beginning to grow restless, some shifting their weight impatiently, others whispering under their breath. Marcus could hear snippets of conversation behind him, a low rumble of irritation rising. A man behind Marcus in a business suit sighed loudly. "What's the hold-up?" he muttered, shifting from foot to foot. "Is this guy even supposed to be in first class?" The whispers grew louder as more passengers joined the line. Marcus stood silently, his hands tightening slightly on the handle of his bag. He had been through this before, the subtle yet unmistakable doubt that clung to him whenever he traveled out of uniform. But it never got easier. Each time it left a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, there would always be people who questioned his right to be where he was. After what felt like an eternity, David returned, this time with a supervisor in tow. The older man, Roger Clark, approached Marcus with a serious expression. He glanced briefly at Marcus before turning his attention to the ID in David's hand. "Just a routine check," Roger said, his tone brisk but lacking warmth. "We need to verify a few things." Marcus's jaw clenched again, but he maintained his calm exterior. "I've provided my ID and explained my purpose for this trip. What more do you need to verify?" The supervisor gave him a blank look. "It's just protocol, sir." Marcus knew this wasn't about protocol. It was about something else entirely. But he had no choice but to wait, watching as precious minutes slipped away. Every delay felt like another strike against his mission, another hurdle he had to clear just to be seen as legitimate. Passengers behind him were growing more vocal now, their frustration bubbling up in murmurs and exasperated sighs. A woman leaned toward another passenger and whispered, "What's taking so long? What's the problem?" Marcus kept his gaze straight ahead, refusing to give in to the mounting pressure. But inside, he could feel the familiar sting of frustration and disappointment, an ache that he had long since learned to live with. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Roger and David exchanged a glance. Roger sighed, his expression softening slightly, as he handed the ID back to Marcus. "Admiral Bradley," he said, his voice now tinged with embarrassment. "You're cleared aboard. We apologize for the delay." Marcus took the ID and nodded curtly. "Thank you." As he walked past the gate and onto the plane, he could still feel the weight of the stairs, the whispers that followed him. Even though he had been cleared, the damage had been done. Once again he had been judged not by his achievements or his rank, but by his appearance. He found his seat in first class and settled in, his thoughts already drifting back to the summit ahead. He had a mission to complete, and no amount of bias or judgment would stand in his way. But as the plane took off, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one more battle in a war he had been fighting his entire life. Marcus settled into his seat in first class, his duffel bag tucked neatly in the overhead compartment. The soft leather felt comfortable beneath him, but his mind was far from at ease. He let out a slow breath, staring out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Outside, the sky was still heavy with clouds, mirroring the weight he felt inside. He tried to push the incident at the gate from his mind. He knew that what had just happened was not uncommon. The subtle glances, the second-guessing of his credentials, it wasn't new to him. Over the years, he had grown used to being questioned, his authority undermined, not because of his competence or rank, but simply because of how he looked. Still, no matter how many times it happened, it never ceased to sting. As the plane lifted into the air, Marcus closed his eyes, hoping to refocus on the summit ahead. His job was too important to let this distraction weigh him down. He thought about the international leaders he'd be meeting in just a few hours, military officials, diplomats, strategists. His role was critical. The decisions made at this summit could determine the course of global military strategy for years to come, and he was one of the few who could help bridge the gap between powerful, often conflicting interests. But the echoes of the recent delay clung to him. It wasn't just about missing his flight or the inconvenience of waiting. It was the principle of it all, the constant battle for legitimacy in the eyes of others. He had earned his rank, his position, through years of service and sacrifice. Yet, here he was, still fighting for respect in the most mundane of circumstances. The hum of the engines provided a steady rhythm as Marcus's thoughts wandered. He remembered another time years ago when he had faced something similar, though the stakes then had felt even higher. He had just been promoted to lieutenant commander, assigned to a crucial naval operation in the Pacific. His commanding officer, Captain John Myers, had always been respectful and fair, but others in the ranks weren't as accepting of his promotion. During one briefing, a senior officer had questioned Marcus's strategy in front of the entire room. It wasn't about the details of the plan. It was about Marcus himself. The officer had questioned whether Marcus had the experience necessary to lead the operation, insinuating that his promotion had been too rapid. Marcus had kept his composure then, just as he had at the airport today. He presented his plan with meticulous detail, defended his decisions with logic and tact. But afterward, The weight of the officer's words had stayed with him for days. He had delivered a successful operation, earning accolades from his superiors, but the seed of doubt that had been planted by that officer had never fully disappeared. It was a reminder that no matter how high he rose, there would always be those who questioned his place. Now, years later, those doubts felt heavier than ever. As Marcus opened his eyes and shifted in his seat, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, do you mind if I sit here?" Marcus glanced over to see a man standing in the aisle, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. The man looked to be in his early 40s, well dressed in a tailored gray suit. His smile was polite, but there was a curiosity in his eyes that Marcus had seen before. "Of course," Marcus replied, nodding as the man slid into the seat beside him. "I couldn't help but notice what happened back at the gate," the man said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Seemed like a bit of a hassle." Marcus stiffened slightly but kept his tone even. "It was just a misunderstanding. These things happen." The man nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. "I'm Paul Edwards, by the way. I work in defense contracting. I've met a lot of military personnel over the years, but I can't say I've ever seen a Navy admiral in jeans and a hoodie. No offense." Marcus studied Paul for a moment, considering his response. He could feel the familiar weight of the conversation shifting. It wasn't outright disrespect, but there was something underneath, a subtle questioning of his place, of his authenticity. "I'm not always in uniform," Marcus replied, his voice calm, "especially when I'm traveling." Paul chuckled softly, leaning back in his seat. "I suppose that makes sense, but you have to admit it's not every day you see someone like you in first class." Marcus felt the words land heavier than Paul likely intended. He knew what Paul meant. He wasn't just referring to the rank. Marcus had heard variations of this sentiment his whole life. "Someone like you." It was a phrase that carried layers of meaning, none of them lost to Marcus. "You'd be surprised," Marcus said simply, turning his gaze back toward the window. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks. Paul fell silent for a while, seemingly content with his own thoughts, but Marcus could still feel the unspoken tension in the air between them. It was the kind of tension that couldn't be easily ignored, the kind that came from a lifetime of being seen as something other. As Marcus sipped his water, he noticed a few other passengers glancing in his direction. Their looks were brief, almost imperceptible, but they carried the same undertone. They had seen the interaction at the gate, had likely overheard parts of the conversation, and just like Paul, they were curious, maybe even a little skeptical. Marcus had experienced it too many times to count, the way people could so easily form conclusions about him based on nothing more than appearance. He knew they were questioning whether he belonged here, whether he truly was who he said he was. It was the same doubt he had felt from Ethan and David back at the gate, the same doubt that followed him wherever he went. And yet, despite all this, Marcus stayed calm. His focus remained on the summit. The work ahead was too important to be distracted by these microaggressions. But deep down, a part of him couldn't help but wonder how much longer he would have to endure these moments, how many more times he would have to prove himself, again and again, just to be seen as legitimate. About an hour into the flight, Paul spoke up again. "You know, I've always admired guys like you," he said, leaning slightly toward Marcus. "The ones who make it to the top. Must have been a tough road." Marcus felt his muscles tense, but he remained composed. He knew this conversation was inevitable. People like Paul often felt the need to express their admiration for men like him, but it always came with an undertone of surprise, as if Marcus's achievements were somehow out of the ordinary for someone like him. "It wasn't easy," Marcus replied, keeping his tone neutral, but I've had a lot of support along the way." Paul nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "I bet. I mean, let's be honest, it can't be easy being, in your position." Marcus's grip tightened around the armrest. He had heard these kinds of comments before, backhanded compliments wrapped in false sympathy. Paul likely thought he was being supportive, but his words carried the weight of assumptions about who Marcus was, about what he had endured, about the barriers he had to overcome simply because of his race. "You'd be surprised how many people in my position have faced similar challenges," Marcus said, his voice measured. "But we're not here because of sympathy. We're here because we're capable." Paul blinked, clearly not expecting that response. He shifted slightly in his seat, looking a bit uncomfortable. Of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise." The conversation trailed off again, and Marcus turned his attention back to his thoughts. He had no intention of engaging further. He had learned long ago that there was no point in explaining himself to people like Paul. They would never fully understand. They couldn't. The plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., and the view of the city sprawled out below, its monuments and government buildings visible from the window. Marcus felt a sense of relief as the plane touched down. He would finally be able to focus on the task at hand. As the plane taxied to the gate, Paul turned to Marcus once more. "Good luck with the summit," he said, offering a half-smile. "I'm sure you'll do great." Marcus nodded, offering a polite smile in return. "Thank you." But as they disembarked, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge wasn't the summit. It was navigating the assumptions and judgments that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Stepping off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. The summit awaited, and there was no room for distraction now. He had a job to do, and he would do it well. But deep down, the weight of the constant battle for respect lingered, just as heavy as ever. As Admiral Marcus Bradley stepped out of the airport into the crisp Washington, D.C. air, he felt the familiar buzz of the city's pulse. The towering monuments and historical buildings loomed in the distance, reminders of the high-stakes decisions made within these walls. But as Marcus walked through the bustling crowd of travelers, that cold, lingering doubt from the airport and plane gnawed at him. He hailed a taxi and gave the driver the name of his hotel, hoping the short ride would allow him to gather his thoughts. The summit was mere hours away, and Marcus knew he couldn't afford to let the distractions of the past few hours affect him. This was the moment he had been preparing for, a moment to influence global defense strategy, to shape policies that would ensure national security for years to come. Yet, as he watched the cityscape pass by outside the window, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenge wasn't the summit itself, but the constant, exhausting battle against the judgment and prejudice he faced along the way. He had overcome so much in his career, yet these moments of doubt, rooted in how others perceived him, continued to shadow his every step. The hotel lobby was grand but sterile, with polished marble floors and the soft hum of classical music in the background. Marcus strode to the reception desk, where a young woman with a tight ponytail and a neatly pressed uniform greeted him with a practiced smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Marcus replied, setting his duffel bag down at his feet. "Admiral Marcus Bradley, I'm here for the International Summit." Her smile faltered slightly, just as the gate agents had. Marcus had grown used to seeing that flicker of surprise whenever he introduced himself by title. The receptionist tapped at her keyboard, eyes darting between the screen and Marcus, as if to verify that the man in front of her matched the name in the system. "Ah, yes, Admiral Bradley," she said, regaining her composure. "I see you're staying in one of our executive suites. Just a moment while I prepare your key." Marcus waited, feeling the familiar tug of frustration. Even here, in this refined setting, There was always that moment of doubt, the silent, unspoken assumptions people made when they saw him. It wasn't just about his appearance or attire. It was the deeper, ingrained biases that colored their perceptions. As the receptionist handed him his key, her smile returned, but it felt practiced, like a mask slipping back into place. "Enjoy your stay, Admiral," she said, her voice as polite as ever. But Marcus could hear the underlying note of surprise, the same tone he had heard countless times before. "Thank you," Marcus replied, taking the key and heading for the elevator. He knew better than to let these moments linger in his mind, but they had a way of piling up, each one a reminder of the uphill battle he faced in even the most mundane interactions. Marcus entered his hotel room, dropping his bag onto the sleek leather chair by the door. The suite was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city below, but despite the luxury surrounding him, Marcus felt a heaviness in his chest, a weariness that went beyond the day's travels. He had only a few hours to prepare before the summit, but he found himself staring out the window, his thoughts drifting back to the day's events. The gate agent, Paul on the plane, the receptionist, was all too familiar, yet it never got easier. How many times had he been questioned, scrutinized, doubted, not for his abilities but for his appearance? As a young officer, Marcus had been taught to compartmentalize, to push through adversity and focus on the mission. But as he climbed the ranks, the microaggressions had only become more insidious, more subtle. And now, as an admiral, it seemed even his title wasn't enough to shield him from the prejudices that trailed him like a shadow. With a sigh, Marcus turned away from the window and began unpacking his briefcase. He couldn't afford to let these distractions consume him. Not now, with the summit so close. The world's eyes would be on him, and his voice needed to be strong and clear. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he achieved, he would always be fighting to be seen as more than just an anomaly, a black man in a position of power. Later that evening, Marcus found himself in the lobby bar of the hotel, waiting for a pre-summit meeting with some of the other military leaders. He sipped a glass of sparkling water, scanning the room. The usual group of diplomats, defense contractors, and military brass filled the space, their conversations a low hum of anticipation for tomorrow's events. Just as Marcus was about to check his phone, General Richard Thompson, a towering figure in the Air Force, approached with a broad smile. "Bradley, good to see you made it." Thompson's booming voice filled the room, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. "General Thompson," Marcus replied, standing to shake his hand. "Good to see you too." Thompson chuckled as he took a seat across from Marcus. "I heard you had a bit of trouble at the airport today. Word travels fast." Marcus stiffened, surprised that the incident had already made its way into the inner circle. "Just some minor delays," he said, trying to keep his tone light. Thompson waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it, you know how it is. These civilians don't always know how to handle men of our caliber." He leaned back in his chair, grinning as if the comment was a joke, but Marcus felt the sting of its underlying truth. "Yeah," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. "I suppose you're right." But inside, he couldn't help but feel the growing pressure. It wasn't just about the airport or the delays. It was about the perception that men like Thompson held. To them, Marcus's struggles were something to laugh off, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of things. They didn't see the deeper issue, the way these moments added up over time, eroding his sense of belonging. As the night wore on, more military officials joined Marcus and Thompson at the bar, their conversation turning toward the upcoming summit. The men discussed strategy, budget proposals, and potential alliances, but Marcus found it hard to focus on. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the day, the casual dismissiveness of Thompson, the constant sense of being out of place. Just as Marcus was about to excuse himself for the evening, a new face joined their group. Paul Edwards, the defense contractor from the flight, approached, a drink in hand. "Admiral Bradley," Paul exclaimed, his face lighting up with recognition. "Good to see you again." Marcus forced a polite nod, his muscles tensed as Paul joined the group. "Paul, good to see you too. I was just telling the general here about our little chat on the plane," Paul said, taking a seat beside Thompson. "This man's got some fascinating ideas about defense strategy." Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest. He hadn't shared any real ideas with Paul during their flight, just endured his veiled condescension. But now, here Paul was, acting as if they were old friends, as if their conversation had been anything more than another reminder of the subtle racism that Marcus faced on a daily basis. "That's great to hear," Thompson said, raising his glass in a toast. "We need more men like you at the table, Bradley." Marcus smiled tightly, but inside he was seething. More men like him? What did that even mean? Was he some kind of token, a novelty to be paraded around as proof of diversity in the ranks? The thought gnawed at him, chipping away at the professionalism he had worked so hard to maintain. As the evening wore on, Marcus felt his patience wearing thin. The casual racism, the unspoken assumptions, the constant questioning of his place, it was all starting to feel like too much. He had endured it for so long, but tonight, with the weight of the summit looming over him, the pressure was unbearable. When Paul made another offhand comment, this time about how impressive it was that Marcus had made it this far, considering how tough things must have been for him, something inside Marcus snapped. "I didn't make it this far by accident, Paul," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. The sudden shift in his tone caught the attention of everyone at the table. "I earned my place here just like everyone else." Paul blinked, clearly taken aback by the sharpness of Marcus's words. "Of course you did," he stammered, his jovial expression faltering. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant," Marcus interrupted, his eyes locking onto Paul's, "and I'm tired of hearing it." The group fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between Marcus and Paul as if unsure how to diffuse the tension. "Listen, Bradley," Thompson began, his voice low. "We didn't mean any offense. We're all on the same team here." Marcus shook his head, feeling the frustration bubbling up inside him. "Are we? Because it sure doesn't feel like it." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm tired of being treated like I don't belong," Marcus replied, his voice rising slightly. "I'm tired of the jokes, the assumptions, the constant second-guessing. I've spent my entire career proving myself, and yet here we are, still having the same conversations." The tension in the room was palpable now, the other officials exchanging uneasy glances as Marcus stood up from the table. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I've earned my place here," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping across the group. "And I don't need your validation to know that." Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the group on him, their silence a mix of shock and discomfort. But he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, Marcus had said what he had been holding inside for years. Marcus made his way back to his suite, his mind racing. He had never spoken out like that before, never allowed himself to voice the frustrations that had been building for so long. But tonight he couldn't hold it in any longer. The weight of the day, of years of microaggressions and subtle racism, had finally pushed him to the edge. As he stood in the quiet of his hotel room, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, and something else he couldn't quite place. He had confronted the issue head-on, but what would the consequences be? Would his outburst come back to haunt him at the summit? Would it damage his relationships with the other leaders? He didn't know, but in that moment, Marcus didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he had spoken his truth, and it felt liberating. Tomorrow, he will face the summit with a renewed sense of purpose. He had a mission to complete, and he wasn't going to let anyone or anything stand in his way. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn, the first pale light of day creeping through the curtains of his hotel room. The events of the previous night hung over him, a cloud of tension that refused to dissipate. He had never been one to confront his colleagues so openly, and the confrontation still weighed heavily on his mind. But today, none of that mattered. He had a job doing a mission of critical importance. He would walk to that summit with his head held high, determined to make his voice heard. Dressed in his formal Navy uniform, Marcus surveyed himself in the mirror. The sharp lines of the dark blue jacket, adorned with medals and ribbons, were a stark contrast to the casual hoodie and jeans he had worn the day before. But more than the clothes, it was the confidence the uniform gave him that mattered. It was armor, both literally and figuratively, a shield against prejudice and judgment that so often followed him. For today, Marcus Bradley was not just a man. He was Admiral Bradley, U.S. Navy, a leader among leaders. He gathered his briefing materials and headed downstairs to the conference room where the summit would take place. The gravity of the event was palpable, and as Marcus walked through the hotel's grand halls, the weight of the global decisions to be made pressed down on him. Military leaders, diplomats, and heads of state from around the world were gathering to discuss the future of global security. The stakes were higher than ever, and Marcus knew that every word he spoke today would matter. As Marcus entered the conference room, he was greeted by the sight of high-ranking officials and military personnel, all deeply engaged in conversation. The room was a sea of decorated uniforms, each person representing their country's interests, ready to debate, negotiate, and decide the future of international defense strategy. The atmosphere buzzed with intensity. Marcus spotted familiar faces across the room. Generals he had worked with before, political leaders he had briefed in previous crises. But despite his standing, Marcus felt the familiar undercurrent of doubt as he walked to his seat near the front of the room. He could sense the eyes on him, the silent assessments being made. He wasn't imagining it. The weight of their judgment was always present. "Admiral Bradley," a voice said from behind. Marcus turned to see General Richard Thompson, the same man from the bar the night before. Thompson's expression was polite, his tone professional, but Marcus could still hear the echoes of the dismissive comment Thompson had made the previous evening. "General Thompson," Marcus replied, his voice cool but steady. "Good to see you." Thompson nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hesitation, perhaps, or maybe a hint of wariness. It was clear that the confrontation from the night before had left an impression. "Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the global defense proposal today," Thompson said. His words were diplomatic, but Marcus could sense the subtext. "I hope you're ready to prove yourself." Marcus nodded curtly, taking his seat. He was ready, more than ready. The opening remarks were delivered by a high-ranking NATO official, setting the stage for the discussions to follow. As Marcus listened, his mind remained sharp, focusing on the critical issues at hand: military cooperation, international defense spending, strategies to counter growing global threats. These were matters that Marcus had spent years studying, and today he would present his recommendations with confidence. But even as the discussions began and each leader took their turn to speak, Marcus couldn't shake the underlying tension that still gripped him. It wasn't just about proving himself as an admiral or defending his ideas. It was about fighting for the respect he knew he deserved. The frustration from the night before simmered just beneath the surface, and Marcus could feel the strain of constantly needing to justify his presence in the room. He knew his ideas were sound, and he knew he had earned his place here. But the weight of the judgments he had faced, first at the airport, then on the plane, and finally at the bar, felt like a heavy burden on his shoulders. The whispers of doubt, the lingering glances, the subtle condescension, they were all a reminder of the unspoken battle he had been fighting his entire career. When it was finally his turn to speak, Marcus stood, his posture rigid, his mind focused. He glanced around the room, seeing the expectant faces of military leaders and diplomats from across the world. The pressure was immense, but Marcus was no stranger to pressure. He took a deep breath, ready to deliver the most important presentation of his career. Marcus's voice was calm but commanding as he began his presentation. He outlined his recommendations for global defense strategies, emphasizing the need for cooperation between allied nations and highlighting the critical areas where resources needed to be allocated. His points were clear, backed by years of experience and data, and as he spoke, the room grew silent, all eyes fixed on him. The tension in his chest began to ease as he gained momentum. He was in his element now, speaking with authority and conviction. The doubts that had followed him throughout the morning began to fade into the background as he focused on the task at hand. This was what he had been trained for, what he had dedicated his life to. But as Marcus continued, he noticed something subtle but undeniable. The way some of the officials in the room exchanged glances, the way their eyes flickered with skepticism. It was the same look he had seen too many times before, the unspoken question of whether a man like him truly belonged in this room, making decisions of this magnitude. Marcus felt a familiar flicker of anger, but he kept it in check. He couldn't afford to let these thoughts derail him. Not now. Admiral Bradley, one of the senior defense officials from Germany, interrupted, his voice polite but firm. I understand your recommendations, but how do you propose we handle the growing dissent among the smaller NATO countries regarding the distribution of resources? There's concern that some of your proposals might exacerbate tensions rather than resolve them. It was a fair question, but Marcus could hear the challenge beneath the words. This wasn't just about defense strategy. It was about testing Marcus's competence. Marcus took a breath, steadying himself. That's a valid concern, General, he said, meeting the man's gaze. But I believe the key is ensuring that all parties have a voice in these negotiations. It's about finding a balance between our larger strategic goals and the needs of our smaller allies. That's why I'm proposing a multilateral approach where each nation has equal representation in the decision-making process. There was a pause, and Marcus could feel the room's attention sharpening. He had prepared for this. He had anticipated the pushback. He continued to outline his plan, addressing each potential concern with precision and confidence. As he spoke, he felt the tide begin to turn. The room was listening, really listening. And for the first time all day, Marcus felt a sense of validation, not just from his own inner resolve, but from the way the other leaders were beginning to acknowledge his ideas. But the battle wasn't over yet. Just as Marcus began to feel the shift in the room, another voice interrupted. This time it was General Ivanov from Russia, a tall, imposing figure with a stern expression. Admiral Bradley, Ivanov said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. Your proposals for resource allocation seem idealistic. In practice, how do you expect these smaller nations to contribute in a meaningful way when they lack the military infrastructure to support such initiatives? It seems to me that your plan overestimates their capabilities. The comment hit harder than Marcus expected. It wasn't just a critique of his strategy. It was a direct challenge to his credibility. For a brief moment, Marcus faltered. The room was watching him, waiting for his response. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him once again. The doubts, the skepticism, it all came rushing back, threatening to undermine everything he had worked for. But then, Marcus remembered why he was here. He had faced far worse challenges in his career. He had led men into battle, made life-and-death decisions, and earned his rank through years of dedication and service. He had nothing to prove to Ivanov or anyone else in this room. With renewed determination, Marcus squared his shoulders and addressed Ivanov directly. "General Ivanov, I understand your concern," he said, his voice steady. "But my plan isn't about overestimating anyone's capabilities. It's about ensuring that every nation, regardless of size, has a role to play in our collective defense. It's about leveraging the strengths of each country and finding ways to support those who may lack the infrastructure but still have valuable contributions to offer. That's how we build a truly united defense strategy." Ivanov's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. The room was silent, the tension thick in the air. Marcus could feel the intensity of their scrutiny, but he stood firm. He had said what needed to be said, and he wouldn't back down. As the summit continued, Marcus found himself once again in the flow of the discussion. The initial tension had eased, and now more of the officials were engaging with his ideas, offering support and constructive feedback. It was a turning point, not just for the summit, but for Marcus personally. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of true validation. Not because he had proven himself to others, but because he had proven something to himself. He had faced doubts, skepticism, subtle racism, and he had emerged stronger on the other side, stronger. But the most significant moment came not from any one comment or proposal. It came from within. As Marcus listened to the other speakers, he realized that the battle he had been fighting wasn't just against the judgments of others. It was against the doubts he had carried inside himself for so long, the fear that no matter what he achieved, he would always be seen as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong. But today, standing in that room, holding his own among the most powerful leaders in the world, Marcus understood something fundamental. His worth wasn't defined by their perceptions. It was defined by his actions, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to his duty. He didn't need their approval to know that he belonged here. He belonged because he had earned it, every step of the way. As the summit adjourned for the day, Marcus stood at the window of the conference room, watching the sun begin to set over the city. The discussions had gone better than he had expected. His proposals were being seriously considered, and he had gained the respect of many of his peers. But more than that, Marcus had gained a new sense of clarity about himself. For so long, he had allowed the doubts and judgments of others to weigh him down, to make him question his place in the world. But today, something had shifted. He had faced those challenges head-on and came out stronger for it. As the room began to empty, General Thompson approached him, a slight smile on his face. "Bradley," Thompson said, his tone more respectful than it had been the night before. "You did good today. Really good." Marcus nodded, accepting the compliment, but not needing it. He had already found the validation he was seeking, within himself. "Thank you, General," Marcus said. "I appreciate that." Thompson clapped him on the shoulder before heading toward the door, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The battle for respect wasn't over. It likely never would be. But today, he had taken a significant step forward, not just in the eyes of others, but in his own heart. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. The summit adjourned for the day, leaving the conference room with a quiet that felt almost eerie compared to the intensity that had filled the air just hours before. Marcus remained near the window, gazing out at the city as twilight began to descend over Washington, D.C. The golden hue of the setting sun cast long shadows over the monuments and government buildings, their towering forms a reminder of the enormous weight of responsibility that came with his position. For the first time in what felt like days, Marcus allowed himself a deep, steadying breath. The adrenaline that had surged through him during the summit had begun to ebb, leaving him with a strange sense of calm. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from knowing everything had been resolved, because he knew it hadn't, but it was a momentary reprieve from the battle he had fought all day, both externally and within himself. His presentation had been a success. Despite the challenges, despite the doubts, his ideas had been taken seriously, and he had earned the respect of his colleagues. He had stood on his ground, spoken with authority, and weathered the storm of skepticism that had threatened to undermine him. And yet, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. The summit wasn't over, and neither was the fight. But for now, he allowed himself this brief moment of stillness. He had faced the day's challenges head-on and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. After a few minutes of quiet reflection, Marcus gathered his briefing materials and exited the conference room. The long, polished hallways of the hotel were nearly empty now, save for a few diplomats and military officials speaking in hushed tones as they passed by. Marcus walked on purpose, though his mind was still turning over the events of the day. The confrontation with General Ivanov had been tense, and for a moment, Marcus had felt the weight of his insecurities almost overwhelm him. The doubts, the same ones he had carried with him for years, had threatened to break through the surface. But instead of succumbing to them, Marcus had pushed forward, using his experience and knowledge to guide him through the storm. He hadn't just earned the respect of the room, he had earned his own respect. That was the victory that mattered most. As he rode the elevator back up to his suite, Marcus replayed the key moments of the summit in his mind. The questions from the European defense officials, the direct challenge from Ivanov, the support he had received from unexpected quarters. It had been a difficult day, but a successful one. Still, something lingered beneath the surface. It was knowledge that despite his personal victory, the fight for recognition and equality was far from over. He had won the day, but the broader struggle continued. Marcus stepped into his suite, the cool air inside the room a welcome contrast to the warm humidity that had settled over the city. He set his materials down on the desk and sank into the armchair by the window. The view was breathtaking, but his mind was far from the cityscape. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the subtle but constant undercurrent of tension he had faced throughout the day. There was always an element of doubt, always a question of whether he truly belonged in these rooms, at these tables, among these leaders. Even now, after years of service and countless accomplishments, Marcus felt the weight of others' judgments pressing down on him. But today was different. Today, he fought back, not with anger or defensiveness, but with clarity and resolve. He had proven to himself more than anyone else that he could withstand the pressure. He had confronted the biases and assumptions that followed him wherever he went, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his power. Yet beneath the surface there was a quiet, nagging voice that reminded him the fight wasn't over. This wasn't the last time he would have to prove himself. Marcus ordered room service, a simple meal of grilled salmon and vegetables, then settled into the quiet of his suite. The tension in his body had begun to unwind, and as he ate, he allowed himself to savor the momentary calm. He hadn't realized just how much he had been holding in, how much pressure he had been carrying on his shoulders. For tonight, at least, he could let go of some of that weight. After dinner, Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The day had been long, and the weight of everything he had experienced was beginning to catch up with him. But as he sat there in the quiet, the buzz of his phone on the desk broke through the calm. Marcus glanced over, picking up his phone to see a series of messages from his assistant back at the Department of Defense. One message in particular caught his eye. "Sir, a few media outlets have picked up on the summit. Some journalists are asking for statements on your proposals and your leadership role. Thought you should be aware." Marcus frowned slightly, his sense of calm interrupted by a ripple of unease. He knew the media attention was inevitable. After all, the summit had major implications for global defense, but the focus on his leadership role gave him pause. He could already imagine how some outlets might frame their coverage. The first black admiral at the forefront of global military strategy. It wasn't that Marcus was ashamed of who he was or what he had accomplished, but the constant focus on his race, on his identity as a black man in a position of power, was exhausting. No matter what he achieved, no matter how hard he worked, it always seemed to come back to that one aspect of his identity. And while he was proud of being a trailblazer, Marcus wanted his work to stand on its own merits. He wanted to be seen as a leader, a strategist, a military expert, not just as a symbol of diversity. He sighed, setting the phone down. The brief moment of peace he had allowed himself was slipping away, replaced by the familiar pressure of living under a microscope. The world was watching, and once again Marcus felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. Later that evening, Marcus received a call from Rear Admiral Michael Hayes, an old friend and trusted ally who had served alongside him for years. Hayes had been following the summit from afar, and he wanted to check in on Marcus's progress. "Marcus," Hayes's voice boomed through the phone. "Heard things went well today. How are you holding up?" Marcus smiled at the sound of his friend's voice, grateful for the support. "It went better than expected," he said. "There were some tense moments, but we made it through." "Good to hear," Hayes replied. "I knew you'd handle it. You always do." The two men talked for a while, catching up on personal matters and discussing the broader implications of the summit. Hayes had always been one of Marcus's strongest supporters, and their conversations were a welcome reminder that not everyone in his world viewed him through the lens of doubt and skepticism. But even as they talked, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the upcoming days pressing down on him. The summit wasn't over, and the challenges that lay ahead were significant. There were still difficult discussions to be had, still tensions to navigate, and while Marcus had weathered the storm so far, he knew that the next few days would be just as critical. The fight for respect, for recognition, wasn't over. It never was. The next morning, Marcus awoke to a barrage of emails and notifications. As expected, the media had picked up on the summit, and several articles had already been published. Marcus scrolled through the headlines, his stomach tightening as he read, "Admiral Marcus Bradley's bold proposals could shape the future of global defense." The first black admiral in U.S. history takes center stage at NATO summit. Is Admiral Bradley the future of U.S. military strategy? On the surface, the articles were positive, even complimentary, but as Marcus read through the coverage, he felt a familiar frustration building inside him. The focus on his race, on his identity as the first black admiral, was front and center in nearly every piece. While the articles praised his proposals and leadership, they also framed his success through the lens of his identity. Marcus understood the significance of being a trailblazer, but he couldn't help but feel that his accomplishments were being overshadowed by the narrative of race. He wanted to be recognized for his ideas, for his strategic mind, for the work he had done to earn his place at the table. But instead, the media continued to define him by his race, reducing his success to a symbol of diversity rather than a testament to his skill and expertise. As Marcus put his phone down, the sense of calm he had felt the night before was slipping away. The respite had been brief, and now the familiar pressures of public scrutiny and expectation were creeping back in. Marcus spent the rest of the morning preparing for the next round of discussions at the summit, But the media coverage weighed heavily on his mind. He knew that the articles, while positive in tone, would inevitably shape how others viewed him in the coming days. The narrative of race would continue to follow him, and no matter what he accomplished, it would always be there in the background. As he arrived at the conference center for the second day of the summit, Marcus could feel the tension building again. The brief calm he had experienced the night before was gone, replaced by the familiar weight of expectation. The eyes of the world were on him, and once again he found himself navigating the complex intersection of race, leadership, and responsibility. The other leaders greeted him with polite smiles and nods as he entered the room, but Marcus could sense the underlying tension. He knew that some of them had seen the media coverage, had read the headlines that framed him as the first black admiral. And while many of them respected him for his ideas, there was always that unspoken element of doubt, whether he was truly here because of his qualifications or because of what he represented. As Marcus took his seat at the table, he steeled himself for the discussions ahead. The calm had been fleeting, and the challenges were far from over. But he had faced these battles before, and he would face them again. The fight for respect, for recognition, was ongoing. And no matter how exhausting it became, Marcus knew he couldn't afford to back down. As the discussions resumed, Marcus focused on the issues at hand, putting aside his frustrations with the media coverage and the subtle doubts that lingered in the room. The conversation shifted to more contentious topics: defense spending, military cooperation, and the delicate balance of power among NATO members. But even as Marcus engaged in the debate, offering his insights and recommendations, he could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. The calm he had hoped for, the sense of peace he had briefly experienced the night before, was gone, replaced by the familiar weight of expectation and judgment. And as the hours passed, Marcus realized that the fight was far from over. The calm had been an illusion, a brief respite in an otherwise unrelenting battle. The road ahead would be just as challenging as the one behind him, and he would need to summon every ounce of strength and resilience to continue the fight. The false calm had been shattered, and now Marcus stood on the precipice of the next storm. The second day of the summit began much like the first, but with one key difference. Marcus Bradley was now the center of attention. He had noticed the shift as soon as he stepped into the lobby of the conference center that morning. The usual respectful nods and polite greetings from other officials were still there, but there was something new behind their eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or even skepticism. He wasn't just another admiral here to discuss defense strategies. He was now the headline. The media frenzy had intensified overnight. News outlets, both domestic and international, had latched onto the story of the summit and, more specifically, the role of Admiral Marcus Bradley. His race, his position, and the fact that he had delivered one of the summit's most critical presentations had made him a symbol, whether he liked it or not. It wasn't just about his ideas anymore. It was about who he was, a black man in a space traditionally dominated by white men, and the world had taken notice. As Marcus made his way through the hallways, he overheard snippets of conversation. Some of them were innocuous, but others carried the subtle weight of judgment. "Did you see the piece on Bradley in the Times?" one voice whispered. "Yeah, they're really playing up the race angle," another responded. Marcus tried to ignore it. He had dealt with this kind of attention before, though never on such a global scale, but the constant focus on his identity felt like a burden he couldn't shake. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to be seen for his expertise, for the years of service he had dedicated to his country. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the work, the media coverage seemed to reduce everything he had accomplished to one narrative: the first black admiral at the center of the summit. It wasn't that Marcus was ashamed of his identity. He was proud of who he was and what he had achieved. but the constant framing of his success through the lens of race felt limiting, like it diminished the scope of his abilities, his intellect, and his contributions. Marcus sat at the long, polished conference table, listening intently as the next speaker took the floor. The discussions were becoming increasingly tense, with NATO officials clashing over resource distribution and military commitments. But even as Marcus focused on the debates, his mind kept returning to the storm brewing outside the conference room. He had seen the articles. He had read the headlines. And while some of them praised his leadership, many of them couldn't seem to get past the fact that he was black. It wasn't just the media either. Some of his colleagues, those who had once treated him with professional courtesy, now seemed to regard him with a certain distance, perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps something more insidious. It was subtle, but Marcus could feel it. The way some of the other military leaders, particularly those from the more conservative nations, seemed to second-guess his input. The way their eyes lingered on him just a moment too long, as if silently questioning whether he truly belonged in the room. Marcus had fought these battles before, quietly, professionally, but they never got easier. No matter how many times he proved himself, no matter how many years he spent earning his rank and position, there was always a sense of doubt lingering in the air. The unspoken question of whether his success was due to merit or simply a result of being the first. He had hoped that his performance at the summit would silence those doubts, at least for a while, but instead it seemed to have amplified them. Now his every word, every action was under scrutiny, and while Marcus had always been confident in his abilities, the weight of that constant judgment was starting to take its toll. During a break between sessions, Marcus found himself approached by Colonel James Harper, a longtime ally from the UK military. Harper was one of the few leaders at the summit whom Marcus truly trusted, a man who had stood beside him in multiple operations and who had always shown him genuine respect. "Marcus," Harper said, clapping him on the shoulder, "good to see you, mate. You've really shaken things up here." Marcus forced a smile. "You could say that." Harper gave him a knowing look. "I saw the media coverage. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? They're making you out to be the hero of the summit, but they're also putting you under the microscope." "That's an understatement," Marcus replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "I'm not sure what's worse, the pressure to live up to their expectations or the constant focus on my race." Harper nodded thoughtfully. "It's not fair, Marcus. You've earned your place here. Everyone knows that. But the media's always going to latch onto the angle that sells the most papers, and unfortunately that means reducing complex issues to simple narratives." Marcus appreciated Harper's honesty, but it didn't make the situation any easier to bear. "I just wish I could focus on the work without all the distractions," Marcus said quietly. "There's too much at stake to be caught up in this media circus." Harper's expression softened. "You've always been a straight shooter, Marcus. You're here because you're one of the best, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but you've got to play the game sometimes. The media, the politics, it's all part of the job, whether we like it or not." "I know," Marcus sighed, "but it doesn't make it any easier." Harper gave him a firm handshake before walking away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. Harper's words had been meant to reassure him, but they had also confirmed what Marcus had been fearing. This wasn't just about defense strategy anymore, it was about perception, and in a world where perception often trumped reality, Marcus knew he had to tread carefully. As the summit reconvened, Marcus found himself seated across from General Ivanov once more. The Russian general had been a thorn in Marcus's side since the beginning of the summit, constantly challenging his proposals and questioning his authority. But today, Ivanov seemed more determined than ever to undermine him. The topic of the session was military spending and the allocation of resources among NATO allies, an issue that had sparked heated debate throughout the summit. Marcus had been one of the leading voices advocating for a more equitable distribution of resources, ensuring that smaller nations had a say in the decision-making process. But Ivanov, representing Russia's interests, had been consistently pushing back, arguing that the smaller nations lacked the military infrastructure to contribute meaningfully to the alliance's overall strategy. As the discussion continued, Ivanov leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Marcus. "Admiral Bradley," he said, his voice carrying a tone of condescension that made Marcus's blood boil. "You've spoken at length about the need for equitable resource distribution, but tell me, how do you propose we deal with the fact that many of these smaller nations are simply incapable of contributing in a way that justifies their share of resources?" Marcus met Ivanov's gaze, keeping his expression neutral despite the rising frustration inside him. "General Ivanov, as I've said before, this isn't just about military infrastructure. It's about leveraging the strengths of each nation, regardless of size. Smaller nations may not have the same military capabilities as larger ones, but they bring other valuable contributions to the table: intelligence, technology, strategic positioning." Ivanov smirked, clearly unimpressed. "That sounds idealistic, Admiral. But in the real world, idealism doesn't win wars. Resources should be allocated to those who can use them most effectively. Anything less is a waste." Marcus felt the room's attention shift toward him, waiting for his response. The tension was thick, and he could sense that this moment would define his standing in the eyes of many in the room. He had to strike the right balance, firm but not defensive, confident but not arrogant. "I disagree, General," Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. "Wars are not won by military strength alone. They're won through cooperation, intelligence, and strategy. If we dismiss the contributions of smaller nations simply because they don't have the same level of resources, we weaken the alliance as a whole. This summit is about finding ways to strengthen our collective defense, not just rewarding the most powerful players." The room was silent for a moment, the tension hanging in the air. Ivanov's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. Marcus had stood his ground, and while he knew that Ivanov wasn't convinced, he could sense that others in the room were beginning to see the value in his argument. As the session continued, Marcus received an unexpected show of support from General Claudia Martinez, a senior officer from Spain who had remained quiet for most of the summit. Martinez, who had been observing the back and forth between Marcus and Ivanov, finally spoke up. "Admiral Bradley is right," Martinez said, her voice firm but measured. "We can't afford to think in terms of military might alone. Smaller nations may not have the same resources, but their contributions, particularly in terms of intelligence and cyber defense, are critical. We need to find a way to incorporate their strengths into the broader strategy." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. Martinez's support was significant, not only because she was highly respected, but because her country, like many others, had been advocating for a more inclusive approach to resource allocation. As the discussion continued, Marcus could feel the tide beginning to turn. More and more officials were beginning to see the value in his proposals, and while Ivanov continued to push back, his opposition was losing momentum. But even as Marcus experienced this small victory, he knew that the larger battle wasn't over. The pressure, the scrutiny, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. The media storm, the doubts of his colleagues, the constant focus on his identity as a black man in a position of power all weighed on him, even in moments of success. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself retreating to the quiet corners of the conference center during breaks, seeking solitude in the midst of the chaos. He needed time to think, to process everything that had happened over the past 2 days. The weight of being constantly scrutinized, of being seen as a symbol rather than an individual, was beginning to wear on him. No matter how many times he proved himself, no matter how many victories he achieved, it always seemed to come back to the same question. Do I really belong here? It wasn't a question of his abilities. He knew he was more than qualified for his role. But the constant focus on his identity, on being the first Black Admiral, made it feel like his achievements were always overshadowed by something he couldn't control. He thought back to the conversations he had overheard earlier, the whispers about his race, the subtle doubts about his competence. He had faced these challenges his entire career, but they never got easier. The burden of representation was heavy, and there were days when Marcus wished he could set it down, if only for a moment. But he couldn't. He knew that, for better or worse, he was a trailblazer. His success wasn't just his own. It carried the hopes and expectations of others who looked up to him, who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles and aspirations. And while that responsibility was an honor, it was also exhausting. As the day drew to a close, Marcus found himself standing alone on the rooftop terrace of the conference center, overlooking the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cool evening air provided a welcome contrast to the intensity of the day's discussions. And for the first time in hours, Marcus felt a sense of quiet. He thought about everything he had accomplished at the summit, the victories, the challenges, the moments of doubt. And as he stood there, watching the lights of the city flicker to life below, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had come a long way. From a young man who had dreamed of serving his country to an admiral standing at the center of one of the most important defense summits in the world, Marcus had achieved more than he had ever imagined. But he also knew that the road ahead would be just as difficult as the one behind him. The fight for recognition, for respect, for equality, it wasn't over, and it likely never would be. As Marcus turned to leave the terrace, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. He had come too far to let the doubts and judgments of others derail him now. He was here because he had earned his place, and he would continue to prove that no matter what challenges lay ahead. The summit wasn't over, and neither was the fight. But Marcus was ready for whatever came next. Marcus Bradley had been here before, standing on the edge of control, feeling the world pressing in on him from all sides. But this time, it was different. The weight of expectation, the media attention, the quiet whispers from his colleagues, all of it had been building for days. And now, as the final day of the summit loomed, Marcus could feel himself nearing the tipping point. The tension in the air was palpable as the summit's most crucial session approached. Today, the leaders would finalize their decisions on military resource allocation and defense cooperation, and Marcus knew his proposals were at the center of the debate. He had worked tirelessly to build support for his ideas, but even now, with so much at stake, there were still those who doubted him, still those who questioned whether he belonged in the room at all. As Marcus walked through the corridors of the conference center, he could feel the eyes on him. Journalists hovered in the background, eager to capture any moment of tension or drama. Military officials whispered among themselves, their glances darting toward Marcus as he passed by. He could sense the anticipation, the silent judgment. It wasn't just about defense strategy anymore. It was about him, about his identity, his race, his place in a world that wasn't always welcoming to men like him. And today, all of it was coming to a head. The session began as expected, with speeches from key military leaders and diplomats. But the atmosphere was different today, tenser, heavier. The stakes had never been higher, and everyone in the room knew it. As Marcus listened to the opening remarks, his mind remained focused on the task at hand. His proposals for equitable resource distribution and enhanced cooperation among NATO allies had gained significant traction over the past 2 days, but there were still powerful voices in the room who opposed him, chief among them, General Ivanov. Ivanov had been a constant thorn in Marcus's side throughout the summit, challenging his authority and undermining his credibility at every turn. Today, Marcus knew Ivanov would make his final and perhaps most aggressive attempt to discredit him. It didn't take long. As Marcus took the floor to present his final recommendations, Ivanov leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and calculating. The Russian general had been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike, and now, with the entire room watching, he made his move. "Admiral Bradley," Ivanov said, his voice sharp and cutting, "you've spoken at length about the need for equal representation and resource distribution among our NATO allies. But tell me, how do you justify these recommendations when it's clear that some nations simply don't have the military capability to contribute at the same level? Are we supposed to weaken our collective defense by giving equal power to those who cannot pull their own weight?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus. The challenge was clear. Ivanov wasn't just questioning Marcus's proposals. He was questioning Marcus's judgment, his authority, his place in the room. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had anticipated this. He had known that Ivanov would come for him, and he had prepared for it. But as he stood there, facing the cold, unyielding stare of the Russian general, Marcus felt the weight of the past few days pressing down on him, the doubts, the whispers, the constant focus on his race and identity. All of it came rushing back, threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. "General Ivanov," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm, "the strength of our alliance is not determined solely by military might. It's determined by our ability to work together to leverage the unique strengths of each nation, regardless of size or resources. Smaller nations may not have the same level of military infrastructure, but they bring valuable contributions to the table: intelligence, technology, strategic positioning. To dismiss their role simply because they don't match the capabilities of larger nations would be a grave mistake." Ivanov's expression didn't change. "That sounds like an idealistic answer, Admiral. But in the real world, idealism doesn't win wars. We need strength, real strength, and that means prioritizing the nations that can actually contribute to our defense." Marcus could feel the tension rising in the room. This was more than just a policy debate. This was a test of his leadership, his authority. He had to be careful and too forceful, and he risked alienating his supporters. Too soft, and he would lose their respect. "Ivanov," Marcus said, his tone sharpening slightly, "if we only prioritize military might, we weaken the foundation of this alliance. This summit isn't just about who has the most firepower. It's about building a coalition that can respond to threats on multiple fronts: cybersecurity, intelligence gathering, strategic partnerships. Every nation here has a role to play, and we need to recognize that." Ivanov's eyes narrowed. He wasn't backing down. Before Marcus could continue, another voice interrupted, this time from General Louise Dupont of France. She had been one of Marcus's more skeptical colleagues throughout the summit, and now she saw an opportunity to weigh in. "Admiral Bradley," Dupont said, her voice measured but firm, "I understand the importance of inclusivity, but General Ivanov has a point. We cannot afford to weaken our collective defense by distributing resources too thinly. There's a reason certain nations carry more weight in these discussions. They have the capabilities to back it up. How do you propose we maintain the balance of power without compromising our security?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus felt the pressure mounting. Dupont's challenge was more diplomatic than Ivanov's, but it carried the same weight. She was questioning his judgment, his ability to lead in a complex, high-stakes environment. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. The room was watching him, waiting for his response. He could feel the eyes of his allies and his detractors alike, all of them silently judging whether he was up to the task. But then, something shifted inside him. A realization, a clarity. He had been here before, standing in front of a room full of doubters, facing the constant questions about his competence, his authority, his right to be in the room. And every time, he had risen to the occasion. He had earned his place here, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. Marcus straightened his posture, meeting DuPont's gaze head-on. "General DuPont, I understand your concerns, but the strength of this alliance doesn't come from concentrating power in the hands of a few. It comes from our ability to adapt, to leverage the unique strengths of all our allies. If we start excluding nations based on their military capabilities, we weaken the very foundation of what NATO stands for: collective defense." He turned to address the rest of the room, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The threats we face today are not the same as they were 50 years ago. It's not just about tanks and missiles. It's about cybersecurity, intelligence, and strategic partnerships. Every nation here has a role to play, and we need to recognize that. If we start prioritizing power over partnership, we risk losing what makes this alliance strong in the first place." The room was silent, but Marcus could sense a shift in energy. He had regained control of the conversation, and even those who had been skeptical were starting to reconsider. DuPont remained silent, her expression thoughtful. Ivanov, however, wasn't finished. "You speak of partnership, Admiral," Ivanov said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But what you're proposing is weakness. You want to spread our resources too thin, to give power to those who haven't earned it. That's not how wars are won. That's how alliances crumble." Marcus felt a surge of anger rise inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Ivanov was baiting him, trying to push him into a reaction that would undermine his credibility. But Marcus wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "Ivanov," Marcus said, his voice cold and precise, "this isn't about weakening our alliance. It's about strengthening it. The world is changing, and we need to change with it. If we cling to outdated notions of power and hierarchy, we'll be left behind. Our enemies are evolving, and so must we." Ivanov's smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't back down. "You speak as though you know better than the rest of us, Admiral. But tell me, how long have you been in this position? How much experience do you really have when it comes to making decisions of this magnitude?" The question was a direct attack, an attempt to undermine Marcus's authority by questioning his experience, and in that moment, Marcus knew that this wasn't just about the summit. Ivanov was targeting him personally, using every opportunity to paint him as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong. For a brief moment, Marcus felt the weight of that doubt, the same doubt he had carried with him for years, the same doubt that had followed him into every room, every conversation. But then, something inside him snapped. He had had enough. Marcus took a step forward, his eyes locked on Ivanov. The room was watching, waiting for his response. But this time, Marcus wasn't just defending his proposals. He was defending his very right to be here. "I've earned my place in this room, Ivanov," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "I didn't get here by accident, and I didn't get here because someone handed me a position. I got here because I've dedicated my life to serving my country, to protecting our allies, and to making sure that we're ready for whatever challenges come our way. And I'm not going to stand here and let you or anyone else question that." Ivanov's expression darkened, but Marcus didn't stop. "You want to talk about experience?" Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. "I've led men into battle. I've made decisions that have saved lives. I've spent years studying the complexities of global defense strategy. And I'm here because I've proven, time and again, that I have what it takes to lead." The room was silent, the tension thick in the air. "And let me make one thing clear," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "This isn't about me. It's about the future of our alliance. It's about making sure we're prepared for the challenges ahead. And if you can't see that, If you're too stuck in your old ways to recognize the value of what we're building here, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong in this room." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Ivanov's face was a mask of anger, but he said nothing. For the first time in the entire summit, he was speechless. For a long moment the room remained silent. Marcus could feel the weight of their attention, their judgment. But this time, it didn't feel like doubt. It felt like something else: respect. General DuPont was the first to break the silence. "Admiral Bradley," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I think you've made your point. Your proposals deserve serious consideration. I, for one, am in favor of moving forward with them." There was a murmur of agreement from several others in the room. Slowly, one by one, more officials voiced their support for Marcus's ideas. Even those who had been skeptical at the start of the summit were now nodding in agreement. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't just about winning the debate. It was about something deeper, something more personal. He had finally confronted the doubts and judgments that had followed him throughout his career. He had stood up to those who had tried to undermine him, not just with words, but with the strength of his conviction. And in that moment, Marcus knew that he had not only earned their respect, he had earned his own. As the session came to a close, Marcus remained seated at the table, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the confrontation. The summit had been a success. His proposals had been accepted, and he had emerged stronger for it. But the emotional toll of the past few days was starting to catch up with him. He had faced down Ivanov, defended his right to be in the room, and proven to himself and others that he was more than capable of leading. But the fight for respect, for recognition, wasn't over. It never would be. As the room began to empty, Colonel James Harper approached Marcus, a broad smile on his face. "Well done, Marcus," Harper said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I think you've shut Ivanov up for good." Marcus smiled, but it was a tiring smile. "Let's hope so." "You did more than just win the debate," Harper said, his tone more serious. "You proved to everyone in that room that you belong here, and I don't think anyone's going to question that again." Marcus nodded, grateful for the support. But even as he accepted Harper's praise, he knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. The fight for recognition, for equality, for respect was ongoing. But today, at least, he had won a small victory. As Marcus left the conference room and stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt a sense of calm settling over him. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at peace. He had faced his greatest challenge, and he had come out stronger for it. But the journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. The grand conference hall that had buzzed with intensity and debate for the past 3 days was now quiet, its chairs empty, the large screens turned off. The summit had officially ended, the decisions had been made, and the world leaders and military officials who had filled the space had returned to their respective countries. Marcus Bradley lingered in the hallway outside the conference room, his mind still processing the events of the past few days. The conversations, the challenges, the moments of doubt, they all seemed to blend together now, a whirlwind of emotion and intensity that had pushed him to his limits. The sun had set over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the city. Marcus stood by the large windows looking out at the monuments illuminated in the evening light. There was a strange quietness to it all, as if the city itself was taking a breath after the storm that had been the summit. He had won, at least in the ways that mattered most. His proposals had been accepted, his leadership had been acknowledged, and he had proven, once and for all, that he belonged at the table with the most powerful military leaders in the world. But even as he stood there soaking in the quiet victory, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The summit had been a test, a grueling, emotionally charged test, and he had passed it. But the world outside this room still held the same challenges it had before. The biases, the judgments, the expectations, they hadn't disappeared. He had earned respect in that room, but respect was something that would need to be earned again and again. Marcus sighed softly, feeling the weight of that realization. The summit might be over, but the fight for equality, for recognition, for respect, was a long and winding road, and there was no clear end in sight. As Marcus turned to leave the conference center, he was stopped by the familiar voice of General Richard Thompson. Thompson, who had been one of the senior leaders at the summit, approached Marcus with a warm smile. There was a noticeable shift in his demeanor from earlier in the week, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Admiral Bradley," Thompson said, extending his hand, "I just wanted to say you did an outstanding job these past few days." Marcus shook Thompson's hand, his grip firm. "Thank you, General. I appreciate that." Thompson glanced around the now empty hallway, as if searching for the right words. "I'll admit," he began, his voice lower, more serious, "when this summit started, I wasn't sure how things would play out. You were under a lot of scrutiny, more than most of us, but you handled it with grace, and you proved yourself." Marcus appreciated Thompson's honesty, but the comment still carried the weight of expectation that had followed him throughout his career. He had proven himself once again, just as he had been doing for years. And while it was good to hear the acknowledgement, it was also a reminder of how much harder he had to work to get the same respect that others took for granted. "I've had a lot of practice," Marcus said, his tone measured but with a hint of weariness. Thompson nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind Marcus's words. "It's not right," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have to keep proving yourself like that, but I think you've made an impression on a lot of people here, myself included, and that counts for something." Marcus offered a small smile, appreciating the sentiment. "It does, but there's still a lot of work to be done." Thompson placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "You've got what it takes, Bradley, and if there's anything I can do to help, you let me know." "Thank you, General," Marcus said, genuinely grateful for the offer. "I'll keep that in mind." With a final nod, Thompson turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone once more in the quiet hallway. As Marcus exited the conference center and stepped out into the cool night air, he felt the familiar weight of leadership settle on his shoulders. The stars above were bright, but the city below was bathed in shadows, a contrast that mirrored the duality of his experience over the past few days. He had achieved a significant victory, but there was no denying the toll it had taken on him. The burden of leadership, especially as a black man in a position of power, was heavy. It wasn't just about making decisions or offering strategic insights. It was about constantly navigating the expectations, the assumptions, and the doubts that came with being a trailblazer. For years, Marcus had carried that burden with quiet strength. He had learned to compartmentalize, to push through the noise and focus on the mission, but the truth was, it weighed on him in ways that few people truly understood. Every success came with a reminder that he was held to a different standard, that his accomplishments were often seen through the lens of his identity rather than his ability. And yet, despite the exhaustion, despite the constant pressure, Marcus knew that he couldn't and wouldn't give up. He had come too far, worked too hard to let the challenges break him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or doubted because of who they were. As Marcus stood there, staring out at the city, he made a quiet promise to himself. No matter how hard the road became, he would continue to walk it. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Leadership, real leadership, meant standing up even when it felt impossible to keep going. The following day, Marcus found himself back at his hotel, packing up his belongings and preparing to return to the Navy base. The summit was over and life would soon return to its usual rhythm. But something had changed within him. The events of the past few days forced Marcus to confront parts of himself. He had long kept buried the doubts, the fears, the anger at the constant need to prove himself. But now, standing in his hotel room with the summit behind him, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced down his greatest challenges, both external and internal, and had come out stronger for it. He had proven, not just to others but to himself, that he was capable of leading at the highest level. And that knowledge gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. As he zipped up his suitcase and prepared to leave, Marcus received a call from Rear Admiral Michael Hayes, his close friend and longtime ally. "Marcus," Hayes's voice boomed through the phone, filled with pride. "I've been following the summit, and I just want to say, you were incredible. I knew you had it in you." Marcus smiled. His tension eased slightly. "Thanks, Michael. It wasn't easy, but we got through it." "I don't think people realize just how much you've done," Hayes continued. "This wasn't just about defense strategy. You've set a precedent for what leadership should look like. You've inspired a lot of people, Marcus, including me." Marcus was silent for a moment, taking in his friend's words. He had always tried to lead with integrity and purpose, but hearing those words from someone he respected meant more than he could express. "I appreciate that, Michael," Marcus said, his voice quiet but sincere. "It's been a long road, but I'm not done yet. There's still a lot of work to be done." "That's the spirit," Hayes replied. "And remember, you're not in this alone. We've got your back." "I know," Marcus said with a nod, "and that makes all the difference." As Marcus left the hotel and headed for the airport, his mind was already turning toward the future. The summit had been an important milestone, but it wasn't the end. In many ways, it was just the beginning. There were still countless challenges to face both within the military and beyond, but Marcus was ready for them. He had come to understand that leadership wasn't just about strategy and decision-making. It was about resilience. It was about standing firm in the face of doubt and pushing forward even when the road was difficult. It was about carrying the weight of expectations, not just for yourself, but for everyone who looked up to you. And in that moment, Marcus realized that his legacy wouldn't just be defined by his rank or his accomplishments. It would be defined by the battles he fought to pave the way for others, those who would follow in his footsteps, inspired by his determination and strength. As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the sky, Marcus looked out the window at the city below, feeling a sense of calm settling over him. The summit was over, but the journey continued. He had faced doubts, the challenges, the judgments, and now he was ready for whatever came next. Because leadership, Marcus knew, wasn't just about being in charge. It was about inspiring others to believe in themselves, to fight for what was right, and to never give up, no matter how hard the road became. And that, more than anything, was the legacy he hoped to leave behind. Months later, back at his naval base, Marcus received a message from the Secretary of Defense. It was a formal letter, but the words inside carried immense weight. The Secretary thanked him for his contributions at the summit and informed him that his proposals were already being implemented in NATO discussions. The letter ended with a simple but powerful sentiment. "Your leadership has set a new standard for what our military can be. We look forward to seeing the impact of your work for years to come." Marcus smiled as he folded the letter and placed it on his desk. The journey ahead was still long, but for the first time in a while, Marcus felt truly at peace with where he was and where he was going. The world was changing, and Marcus Bradley was ready to help shape its future. Months after the summit, Marcus Bradley stood on the deck of the naval base, looking out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore was a comforting sound, a reminder of the constancy of the sea, the way it kept moving forward, no matter the storms it had faced. For Marcus, it was a perfect metaphor for his own journey. The months following the summit had been busy, to say the least. Marcus's proposals for NATO had not only been accepted, but were now being actively implemented. His ideas about resource allocation and cooperation between smaller and larger nations were reshaping how military alliances were formed. What had once been a contentious idea was now being heralded as a new, more inclusive vision for global defense. But more than the strategic victories, Marcus had gained something even more valuable, a deeper sense of who he was as a leader. The summit had pushed him to his limits, tested his resolve, and forced him to confront the biases and judgments that had followed him throughout his career. And while those challenges hadn't disappeared, Marcus now faced them with a stronger sense of purpose. As he stood there, gazing out at the horizon, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the battles he had fought both on the battlefield and in the boardroom. He thought about the countless moments of doubt, the whispers that had followed him into every room, questioning his right to be there. And he thought about the victory he had earned at the summit, not just in terms of policy, but in terms of self-respect. For so long, Marcus had felt the need to prove himself, to show the world that he was more than just a symbol. But now he realized that his identity, the very thing that had been both a burden and a source of pride, wasn't something to overcome. It was something to embrace. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see Rear Admiral Michael Hayes, his longtime friend and confidant, walking toward him with a broad smile. "Enjoying the view?" Hayes asked, his voice full of warmth. Marcus smiled. "Always. There's something about the sea that puts things in perspective." Hayes nodded, joining Marcus at the railing. The two men stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the waves roll in. Hayes had been one of Marcus's biggest supporters throughout his career, and their friendship had only deepened after the events of the summit. "I've been hearing good things about the NATO proposals," Hayes said after a while. "Sounds like they're really taking off." Marcus nodded. "It's been a long road, but I think we're finally seeing the changes we talked about. Smaller nations are getting a bigger voice, and the new cybersecurity initiatives are making a real difference." Hayes glanced at Marcus, his expression thoughtful. "You've done something incredible, Marcus, not just at the summit, but throughout your career. You've opened doors for people who would never have had the chance to walk through them if it weren't for you." Marcus's smile was quiet, reflective. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Hayes agreed, "but you led the way, and that's what matters." Marcus looked out at the horizon again, feeling the weight of Hayes's words. He had always been aware of the responsibility that came with being a trailblazer, the pressure, the scrutiny, the expectations. But now he saw it as something more than a burden. It was an opportunity to make a lasting impact not just on the military but on the world. As Marcus and Hayes continued to talk, their conversation shifted to the future, the next generation of leaders who would follow in their footsteps. Marcus had always believed in the power of mentorship and the importance of lifting others up as he climbed the ranks. And now, more than ever, he felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure that those who came after him would have an easier path than he had. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," Marcus said, his voice contemplative. "Not just for me, but for the Navy, for the military as a whole. We've made some progress, but there's still so much work to be done." Hayes nodded. "It's not going to change overnight, but you've laid the groundwork. You've shown that it's possible to break through the barriers even when they seem impossible to overcome. Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but he knew that change wasn't just about breaking through barriers. It was about building something new in their place. It was about creating a military that was truly inclusive, where leaders were chosen based on their abilities, not the color of their skin or the assumptions about their background. That's why mentorship is so important, Marcus said, his voice firm. We need to make sure that the next generation has the tools and support they need to succeed. I want to make sure that no one has to fight the same battles I did just to prove they belong. Hayes smiled. You've always been a teacher at heart, Marcus. I think that's why people respect you so much. You're not just leading for yourself, you're leading for everyone around you. Marcus felt a surge of pride at his friend's words. He had always believed that leadership was about service, about lifting others up and making sure they had the opportunity to succeed. And now, more than ever, he was committed to that mission. In the weeks that followed, Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed energy. The summit had been a turning point, but it was only the beginning. There were new challenges on the horizon, new threats to national security, new strategies to develop, new leaders to mentor. Marcus's proposals were continuing to gain traction within NATO, and he was already working on a new initiative to strengthen cybersecurity defenses among allied nations. It was a complex, ever-evolving field, but Marcus was excited by the possibilities. He knew that the world was changing, and the military needed to change with it. But it wasn't just about strategy and policy. Marcus was also focused on building a more inclusive military, one where the next generation of leaders would have the opportunity to thrive. He had started a mentorship program for young officers, offering guidance and support to those who showed promise but might have been overlooked in the past. It was his way of giving back, of ensuring that the progress he had fought for would continue long after he was gone. As he sat in his office one afternoon, reviewing a report on the new cybersecurity initiative, Marcus received an email from a young lieutenant in the program. The message was simple, but it struck a chord in Marcus's heart. Admiral Bradley, I just wanted to thank you for your mentorship. Your guidance has given me the confidence to pursue leadership roles I never thought I could reach. You've shown me that anything is possible, and for that I'm forever grateful. Marcus sat back in his chair, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. This was what it was all about, not the accolades, not the headlines, but the impact he was having on the lives of others. The legacy he was building wasn't just about his own success. It was about the success of those who would come after him. As the months turned into years, Marcus's influence continued to grow. His work within NATO reshaped the way global defense strategy was approached, and his mentorship program became a model for other branches of the military. He had become not just a leader, but a symbol of what was possible when determination, integrity, and resilience were combined with opportunity. But more than that, Marcus had become a beacon of hope for those who had long been told that they didn't belong, that they would never rise to the highest levels of leadership. His story was a testament to the power of perseverance, and his legacy was one of hope. As he looked toward the future, Marcus knew that the challenges ahead would be many, but he also knew that he was ready for them. The summit had taught him that leadership wasn't just about being in control. It was about standing tall in the face of adversity, about inspiring others to do the same. And as Marcus Bradley continued to lead, to mentor, and to serve, he did so with the knowledge that his legacy was already being written, not just in history books, but in the hearts and minds of those he had touched along the way. One evening, after a long day at the base, Marcus sat in his office, a cup of coffee in hand. The quiet hum of activity outside his window was a reminder that in the world of defense and leadership, work never truly stopped. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He had come a long way. From the young officer trying to prove himself, to the admiral standing at the helm of global military strategy. The road had been hard, and the challenges had been many, but Marcus had never wavered in his commitment to doing what was right. As he sipped his coffee, Marcus thought about the future, about the young leaders he was mentoring, about the changes still to come, about the world he was helping to shape. He knew that the fight for equality, for recognition, for respect was ongoing. But now, with the strength of experience behind him and the support of those who believed in him, Marcus was ready for whatever came next. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as Marcus Bradley looked ahead, he knew that he would continue to lead with integrity, courage, and resilience, because that, more than anything, was the true measure of a leader. Thank you for following Marcus Bradley's inspiring journey of leadership, resilience, and hope. His story is a reminder that no matter the obstacles, determination and integrity will always prevail. If you enjoyed this story and want to read more narratives of courage, leadership, and perseverance, don't forget to subscribe and stay connected. There's so much more to come. Hit that subscribe button and join the community for more powerful stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Bell.